Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. Puerto Ricans are American citizens. They carry U.S. passports. They serve in the U.S. military. They use the U.S. dollar. But they cannot vote for the president who appoints the officials that govern them. They have no voting representation in Congress. And when their government collapsed under debt, they were not allowed to declare bankruptcy like a U.S. state. At the same time, everything they buy, food, fuel, medicine, costs more than it does in Florida. Not because of geography, not because of hurricanes, but because of federal law. For more than a century, Puerto Rico has existed inside the American system, but never fully within it. So the real question isn't whether the island struggles. It's whether the structure around it was ever designed for it to succeed. To understand that, we have to start with something simple. The price of milk. In a grocery store in San Juan, a gallon of milk often costs more than it does in Orlando. The same is true for cereal, construction materials, gasoline, and basic household goods. Puerto Rico imports the overwhelming majority of what it consumes, and nearly all of it arrives by ship. On an island, transportation is not a detail. It is the economy. At first glance, higher prices might seem like a simple consequence of geography. Puerto Rico is separated from the mainland by open water, but distance alone does not explain the premium. The island sits along one of the busiest shipping corridors in the hemisphere. Cargo vessels from Europe, Asia, and Latin America pass nearby every day. In theory, competition should lower costs. Instead, federal law restricts how goods move between Puerto Rico and the mainland United States. Under the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, commonly known as the Jones Act, any goods transported between two U.S. ports must travel on ships that are U.S. built, U.S. owned, U.S. flagged, and primarily U.S. crewed. Because Puerto Rico is legally treated as a U.S. port, the rule applies. The practical result is a narrower pool of eligible vessels and higher shipping expenses. Foreign ships carrying goods to the mainland cannot simply continue on to San Juan with domestic cargo. In many cases, goods are first delivered to a mainland port, transferred onto Jones Act-compliant vessels, and then shipped onward. Each step adds cost. Those costs do not remain in the shipping industry. They are absorbed by businesses and passed along to consumers. For households earning significantly less than the average U.S. mainland income, even small price differences compound over time. The structural premium affects food, energy, and building materials, the foundations of daily life. Supporters of the Jones Act argue that it protects national security by sustaining a domestic merchant fleet. Critics contend that its burden falls disproportionately on non-contiguous jurisdictions like Puerto Rico. What matters for this story is not the intention behind the law, but the authority behind it. Puerto Rico does not control this rule. Congress does. The island's residents are American citizens. They are subject to federal trade law, yet they have no voting representation in the Congress that writes and amends it. The higher cost of living is not simply a market outcome. It is the downstream effect of a political arrangement. The Jones Act is not the only federal statute shaping Puerto Rico's economy, but it is a visible example of a broader reality. Washington can structure the island's commercial environment without granting it equal influence in the decision-making process. To understand how that authority became possible, we have to examine the legal category that defines Puerto Rico itself. The authority to impose federal law on Puerto Rico without full political reciprocity did not emerge accidentally. It was constructed at the turn of the 20th century, after the United States acquired the island from Spain in 1898. The transfer followed the Spanish-American War, and like other territorial acquisitions of the era, it raised a constitutional question. When the United States gains new land, do all constitutional protections automatically apply? The Supreme Court addressed that question in a series of rulings known as the Insular Cases. The justices concluded that newly acquired territories could be classified differently depending on their status. Some would be incorporated, placed on a path toward statehood. Others would be deemed unincorporated, meaning they belonged to the United States but were not fully part of it. Puerto Rico was placed in the latter category. According to the court, only certain fundamental rights would apply automatically. Congress retained broad discretion over the rest. This distinction allowed the federal government to exercise sovereignty without extending the full political structure of the Union. The language used in the decisions reflected the assumptions of the era. The court described the island as populated by people who were culturally distinct from the mainland and therefore unsuitable for immediate constitutional integration. Whether framed in terms of administrative flexibility or racial theory, the outcome was the same. Puerto Rico's relationship to the United States would be structurally unequal. In 1917, Congress granted U.S. citizenship to Puerto Ricans through the Jones-Shafroth Act. Citizenship brought certain protections and obligations, including eligibility for military service. It did not bring voting representation in Congress or participation in presidential elections. The island remained subject to federal authority without full electoral influence over it. This legal architecture explains how the Jones Act can operate as it does. Because Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory, Congress may regulate its commerce under the Territorial Clause of the Constitution. Puerto Ricans cannot vote in federal elections to change that law, yet they are bound by its consequences. The same framework would later shape tax policy, debt law, and fiscal oversight. Each federal statute rests on the same foundation. Puerto Rico is governed by Congress, but not represented in it. The imbalance is not incidental. It is built into the legal category that defines the island. And that category did more than permit shipping restrictions. It created the conditions for a different experiment, one that briefly made Puerto Rico appear prosperous, before revealing how conditional that prosperity truly was. By the 1970s, policymakers in Washington faced a recurring concern. Puerto Rico's economy, long dependent on agriculture and federal transfers, needed a more durable engine of growth. The solution Congress chose did not grant the island new sovereignty. It offered a tax incentive. In 1976, lawmakers enacted Section 936 of the Internal Revenue Code. The provision allowed U.S. corporations operating in Puerto Rico to repatriate profits to the mainland without paying federal corporate income tax on those earnings. For multinational firms, the island became a highly attractive jurisdiction. American in legal status, but fiscally distinct. The impact was immediate. Pharmaceutical manufacturers, electronics producers, and medical device companies established facilities across the island. Industrial parks expanded. Manufacturing employment increased. For a period, Puerto Rico became one of the leading pharmaceutical production hubs in the Western Hemisphere. On paper, the Commonwealth model appeared vindicated. The island's GDP rose. A middle class expanded. Public revenues improved. The narrative shifted from dependency to modernization. But beneath the surface, the growth was tied to a single variable, the continued existence of a federal tax preference. Section 936 did not create a fully diversified domestic economy. It incentivized external corporations to locate capital-intensive operations on the island. Local supply chains developed around those firms, but ownership and strategic decision-making remained elsewhere. Puerto Rico's prosperity depended on decisions made in corporate boardrooms and in Congress. Over time, critics in Washington began questioning whether the incentive served national interests. Some argued that companies were using the island primarily to shelter profits rather than to expand productive capacity. Others viewed the exemption as an inefficient subsidy. By the mid-1990s, political momentum had shifted. In 1996, Congress voted to phase out Section 936 over a 10-year period. The rationale was fiscal discipline and tax reform. The consequences for Puerto Rico were less central to the debate. The same Congress that had created the incentive now set a timetable for its expiration. For the island, the change was not abstract. Corporate investment strategies are long-term calculations. As the sunset date approached, firms reassessed their presence. The prosperity of the preceding decades had been conditional, contingent on a federal statute. When that statute began to disappear, so did the foundation beneath the economy. The experiment had demonstrated that Puerto Rico could grow rapidly under the right conditions. It also revealed that those conditions were not within its control. The phase-out of Section 936 concluded in 2006. By then, corporations had already begun adjusting. Some facilities downsized. Others closed entirely. Production shifted to jurisdictions offering new tax advantages, often outside the United States. What had once been a competitive edge for Puerto Rico vanished almost overnight. The effects were measurable. Manufacturing employment declined sharply. Government revenues contracted as corporate activity slowed. The island entered a recession in 2006, a recession that would persist year after year. While the mainland experienced a financial crisis beginning in 2008 and eventually recovered, Puerto Rico never returned to sustained growth. The difference lay in structure. The mainland economy is diversified and supported by federal stabilization tools. Puerto Rico's economy had been disproportionately anchored to a tax provision that no longer existed. When Congress removed the incentive, there was no equivalent replacement. Population trends compounded the strain. As job opportunities diminished, migration to the mainland accelerated. Residents left in search of employment, reducing the local tax base. Fewer taxpayers meant fewer public resources, which in turn placed additional pressure on government services. To bridge the fiscal gap, Puerto Rico increased borrowing. Municipal bonds became the instrument of choice. Investors were attracted by their triple tax-exempt status, exempt from federal, state, and local income taxes. Demand remained strong, even as underlying economic fundamentals weakened. Debt accumulated gradually at first, then rapidly. By the early 2000s, public liabilities had climbed into the tens of billions of dollars. Servicing that debt consumed a growing share of the budget. Yet the island lacked one of the primary mechanisms available to distressed U.S. jurisdictions. In 1984, Congress had amended federal bankruptcy law to exclude Puerto Rico from Chapter 9 protection. States and their municipalities could seek court-supervised restructuring. Puerto Rico could not. It was authorized to borrow like a state, but denied the restructuring tools of one. As revenues stagnated and obligations mounted, the island faced a narrowing set of options. The recession that began with the repeal of Section 936 evolved into a fiscal crisis. And because the legal framework placed ultimate authority in Washington, the resolution would not originate solely in San Juan. By 2015, Puerto Rico's governor publicly acknowledged that the island's debt was not payable. Credit markets had already reached that conclusion. Bond prices fell, credit ratings were downgraded, and investors began preparing for default. The fiscal imbalance was no longer theoretical. It was immediate. In a typical U.S. state, severe financial distress can lead to Chapter 9 bankruptcy, allowing courts to supervise the restructuring of debt. Detroit had done so only 2 years earlier. Puerto Rico attempted to pass its own local restructuring law, but creditors challenged it. The case reached the Supreme Court, which ruled that federal law preempted Puerto Rico's efforts. The reason traced back to the 1984 amendment excluding Puerto Rico from Chapter 9. The island was barred from accessing the same bankruptcy protections available to states, yet it remained subject to federal control. It could borrow extensively, but it could not unilaterally renegotiate. Congress responded in 2016 with the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, PROMESA. The law established a Financial Oversight and Management Board appointed by the President of the United States. The board was granted authority over fiscal plans, budgets, and negotiations with creditors. For many Puerto Ricans, the arrangement felt like a suspension of local democracy. The island's elected officials continued to serve, but their budgets required approval from an unelected board headquartered outside the territory. Fiscal policy became subject to federal oversight in a direct and visible way. To meet restructuring targets, the board approved austerity measures. Public sector employment declined. Pensions were reduced. Schools closed as enrollment fell and budgets tightened. The University of Puerto Rico saw significant funding cuts. Each action was framed as necessary to restore fiscal balance. PROMESA did initiate a court-supervised restructuring process under a special legal framework. Portions of the debt were renegotiated, yet the deeper dynamic remained intact. The authority to restructure, to impose oversight, and to define the fiscal path forward rested in Washington. Puerto Rico's fiscal crisis was often described as a local failure, but the tools available to address it were defined by federal statute. The same legal category that allowed Congress to impose shipping restrictions and withdraw tax incentives now allowed it to govern the island's budget directly. Then, before the restructuring process had fully stabilized the island, a different kind of shock arrived, one that would test the practical meaning of territorial citizenship. In September 2017, Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico with sustained winds exceeding 150 miles per hour. The storm crossed the island from southeast to northwest, damaging homes, roads, and critical infrastructure. The electrical grid, already weakened by years of underinvestment, collapsed almost entirely. Within hours, nearly all residents were without power. The blackout extended for months. Hospitals relied on generators. Water treatment plants failed. Remote communities were cut off by landslides and blocked roads. The physical destruction was severe, but the prolonged disruption of services deepened the crisis. Studies later estimated thousands of excess deaths in the aftermath, many tied to the extended collapse of essential systems. Federal disaster response mobilized, but comparisons quickly emerged. Earlier that season, hurricanes had struck Texas and Florida. In those states, federal aid flowed rapidly, and public attention remained intense. In Puerto Rico, logistical challenges were real. Damaged ports and airports complicated delivery, yet the pace and scale of assistance became a subject of debate. The difference was not solely geographic. Political representation shapes urgency. Texas and Florida send voting members to Congress. Their governors wield influence in federal elections. Puerto Rico does not. Its residents are citizens, but they do not vote for the president or voting members of Congress who allocate disaster funds. As recovery efforts unfolded, the Financial Oversight and Management Board continued to enforce fiscal targets. Even in reconstruction, budgets required approval. The island was rebuilding under supervision. Federal aid was substantial in aggregate, but disbursement was gradual and often conditioned on compliance measures. At the community level, residents organized mutual aid networks. Local groups cleared debris, distributed supplies, and began installing small-scale solar systems to reduce reliance on the centralized grid. Resilience became a necessity rather than a slogan. Hurricane Maria did not create Puerto Rico's structural imbalance. It illuminated it. The storm revealed how territorial status affects not only trade policy and tax law, but crisis response and political leverage. By this point, the pattern was visible. Shipping costs shaped daily expenses. Tax policy created and then withdrew economic growth. Bankruptcy exclusions deepened debt. Oversight boards governed budgets. Disaster response unfolded within a hierarchy of representation. The question was no longer whether Puerto Rico could endure hardship. It had done so repeatedly. The question was whether the framework surrounding the island allowed it to shape its own trajectory, or whether that trajectory remained contingent on decisions made elsewhere. In the years following Hurricane Maria, visible signs of recovery began to emerge. Tourism returned in force, aided by reconstruction spending and renewed global attention. Federal recovery funds flowed into infrastructure projects. Hotels reopened. Cruise ships resumed regular routes. On the surface, Puerto Rico appeared to be stabilizing. At the same time, new tax incentives reshaped the island's economic landscape. Under what is now consolidated as Act 60, high-income individuals and certain businesses can relocate to Puerto Rico and significantly reduce or eliminate federal taxes on specific types of income. The policy is legal, deliberate, and designed to attract outside capital. And it has worked in measurable ways. Investment has increased in select sectors. Luxury developments have expanded in parts of San Juan and along the coast. Property values in some neighborhoods have climbed sharply. Puerto Rico has positioned itself as a favorable jurisdiction for finance, digital assets, and remote entrepreneurship. But the benefits are uneven. While outside investors arrive seeking tax efficiency, many Puerto Ricans continue leaving for the mainland in search of stable employment and lower living costs. In certain communities, rising real estate prices have made home ownership more difficult for longtime residents. The island is gaining wealth, but not always retaining its people. This is not a simple story of exploitation or prosperity. It is a story of asymmetry. Capital can move freely into Puerto Rico under federal incentives. Residents, meanwhile, remain subject to federal trade law, federal fiscal oversight, and a political status that limits their representation in the system shaping those incentives. The structure has not fundamentally changed. The Jones Act still governs shipping. The Financial Oversight and Management Board continues to oversee fiscal plans. Congress retains authority under the Territorial Clause. Puerto Rico can attract investment, rebuild infrastructure, and export culture to the world. But the rules that determine who benefits and under what conditions are still written elsewhere. Across more than a century, the pattern is consistent. When federal incentives align with local opportunity, growth accelerates. When federal priorities shift, the consequences follow quickly. Puerto Rico advances, but within boundaries it did not design. The island's future remains possible. Its resilience is evident. Yet its trajectory continues to move inside a framework where sovereignty is partial, authority is external, and success is conditional.